Thank you all for coming. This is really nice, and I'm really happy to be on this amazing panel as well, to kind of launch the sound piece, but also to talk about, I think, one of the key motives or reasons why I wanted to make the piece the way that I did, and that was because I realized that when I was younger, we never talked about money. Not in any meaningful way, anyway. And that was kind of the impetus for this whole piece, and for this whole project and kind of the way that I went about it. So for this panel, I thought it would be awesome to invite some other people to kind of think about that, to think about how we conceptualize our relations. Right, our relationships economically, our relationships socially, and so on, and how we can crystallize those into games that interrogate those relationships, because that was kind of what I really wanted to do with this piece and with the little pack that comes after us, which we're all going to talk about. So yeah, I'm glad you're all kind of here on this journey with me for this. I'm going to go first, because I decided I would be the sacrificial lamb tonight. And I'm going to talk about the pack, basically, that came, that we kind of developed as part of the sound installation. So if we put the first slide on. Ah, great, there it is. Woo. So this piece is called Crystals of a Social Substance, which comes from Marx. And we decided to call this 𝘀cie because it was probably the most popular title of all the ones that we had. And when I kind of was conceiving it, I was thinking about when I was a teenager at school, and I don't know if everyone's had this experience, but there was always a poor kid at school. I know that's super harsh, but I was the poor kid when I was at primary school, and then when I got to secondary school, there was one person in particular who I think just got all the flack, right? Because they came from this super poor background, and we never talked about it. Everybody in the school knew this. All the kids knew it. All the teachers knew it. It was really, really obvious. It was really, really clear. But there was never once a lesson or an exercise or a conversation or anything that in any way addressed why this particular person had so much less than everybody else. So yeah, we decided to kind of go with that. If you go to slide 2, please. So in the very kind of early phases of developing the sound piece, this was kind of my notebook. And you can kind of see that I was just throwing together some ideas about how to kind of put this together. And I'd say there were 2 elements that kind of jumped out. And the first one was maybe the big red arrow at the top, which it says, I would like a teacher or student to feel like they might be able to better broach discrepancies, something that's kind of reusable. And then the second one at the bottom, which is a lesson on difference. This is something that's never really addressed in school because there's no space for it. And I think there's no space for it because there's often very few resources that kind of allow us to talk about it. So in both the game and the sound piece, I would say that I wanted to do 4 things. First of all, I wanted to kind of find a way for people to just notice what's kind of going on around them and to notice the way that money appears, right? It's this kind of physical set of notes, but it's also the appearance of things around us. Second, I wanted to move beyond some of the more obvious questions or some of the more obvious ways that money is discussed. Third, I wanted to kind of ask questions that are maybe a bit difficult and a bit challenging. And this was something that kind of came up in the development side of it because some of the questions I wanted to ask, I think were a bit too intense for 7 to 14-year-olds. Nonetheless, I wanted to kind of ask them. So maybe that's for the later package. And then the fourth one was that I wanted it to be about doing. So I wanted the pack to have exercises and ways that we could kind of enact some of the social relations as well. So on slide 3, or next slide even. So we played this game which is called Class Struggle. Has anyone played this game? No one's played. Has anyone played Monopoly? Yeah, exactly, right? So this is kind of why I wanted to play this game. It's a really amazing game by this guy named 𝗀cie𝗂𝘁, and it's cool. It's basically like you have to build alliances and set up like trade unions and things like this in order to get to the end, which is revolution. But even when you get to the end, the capitalists can still win, and so you can end up with either socialism or barbarism. It's not the most fun game, I have to confess. It's okay, but it has its limitations. Nonetheless, it was kind of like one of the games that was kind of behind the development of 𝘁𝗁. We also like looked at a game called 𝘀𝗀 Spies, which I think is a kind of like midlife crisis sort of Christmas alcoholism game. And then also tarot. I would definitely have characterized this game 𝘁𝗁 as like money tarot for children. And then Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies, which I think is like super famous and like kind of like well-known series of cards that aim to get people to kind of like think differently. And then the fourth was Settlers of Catan, which is an awesome colonial game where you kind of take over people's land. But we really like the kind of hexagonal kind of nature of that, and that was actually Ben's like genius insight, which is why the cards are hexagonal. So we move on to the next. So this is the kind of development of it. Like we looked at like those little pizza sweets that you can get from like a sweet shop, and then I was like, what if you had a game that was about redistribution? So like slice of the pie or something like this, and then I decided to call it pie. And then I also like looked at like different ways that we can think about like putting things together. So the relational side of it would be kind of spatial and like geometrical. So those were mirror-ori folds that I like cut out and tried with those. And I also thought about Penrose tiles, which are kind of infinite patterns that never repeat. I also looked at things like Gödel's incompleteness, which is like a truth statement that has no proof. And I kind of went through all of those, and of course, you know, you go through all of that only to end up with the next slide. Keep going, next one. That was what it kind of ended up looking like initially. So basically we went through all of that to end up with kind of like this, which was just a series of like super geometric, really nicely colored, really simple like hexagons that kids could kind of engage with. And so there's kind of like two sides to the game. You can like play around with all of these shapes, and you can like make something like super spatial and beautiful. But then there's also this kind of like other side to it, which is the next slide, which is a series of prompts. And this is really like oblique strategies, but like kind of like applied to this idea of money. So I kind of wanted the prompts to be a series of things, to be super difficult questions, like where does money come from? Is it okay to steal? Combined with things that are a bit more kind of like lateral thinking. So if money could talk, what would it say? What is the sound of money? Hopefully the sound piece might be the sound of money, for example. And then things that were also a little bit more like pointy and sharp and spiky. So the government bans luxury flats is obviously a nod to the fact that that's all that happens with spaces these days. It's like, oh, look, there's a park, let's turn it into luxury flats. So like, I wanted to kind of like talk about some of those like little like social things as well. We had some questions in here that were like a lot more kind of like confronting, and we realized that actually that was too much for kids, like 7 to 14, and we needed to really think about how that might feel to receive something that kind of like directly like prodded, you know, the very sensitive issue of like having no money. So hopefully these prompts are a lot more kind of like open and like creative, and even though they're aimed at like 7 to 14, are still challenging in some way. I actually find some of these still a little bit challenging as an adult. So if we go on to the next slide. So those were basically the instructions. Start a conversation, draw a response, write your thoughts, make a swap, create a pattern, listen to yourself and others, invent your own way to play, shuffle, swap, skip, change it all. There are no wrong answers. And I would say that listen to yourself and others was probably the most important one and the key one, and the one that I think meant the most to me. Certainly when I think back to my like 10-year-old self, it would have just been so nice to have had a way to understand that my financial situation and my economic situation wasn't my fault. There was a larger social structure associated with it. So yeah, that was the kind of development, and so this is what they look like. We made a kind of dummy version of the game, and yeah, so there's basically like 120 different little cards, and they're going to be available here once the piece launches on Sunday. And they're also going to like 4,000 kids, I think, around London, so they'll be able to kind of play this as well, which is super awesome. So yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So yeah, that was kind of like my piece. I guess it would make sense to just kind of like jump right on to Lola Olufemi. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was really wonderful. So, could I have my slide up, please? I can just start talking then.
Yeah, just.
So, yeah, when Jay asked us to kind of come up with this idea or to think of a game, I was really struck because I was like, oh, okay, this is a real invitation to imagine. It's an invitation to kind of go back to like childhood and play and all of these things that we put away when we're adults. So for me, I've been thinking recently about kind of like habitation and design and what it would mean to understand, you know, the spaces that we occupy as capable of kind of like leaving imprints and impressions and echoes on us as people, but also on our capacity to imagine. So like I said, I thought of this as a kind of imagination experiment. The slides that I was going to show were two kind of pictures. So one was a picture of a project that June Jordan did with Buckminster Fuller in 1965, where she attempted to redesign Harlem in the wake of the murder of James Powell, who was a black teenager. And the other was a kind of like early design of Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham. And yeah, I was thinking about these kind of two spaces, and the latter I was thinking about because it kind of represents, there it is, the kind of failure of utopian design. If you go to Broadwater Farm Estate, you can see the vision that the council had, but that never really kind of came to fruition. And so I've been thinking a lot about space. And I wanted to read, in order to kind of contextualize my game that I'll go on to explain, I wanted to read just a little section from this book that I just wrote called Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, which is about the purpose of design. So it starts with this quote by June Jordan, and she says, quote, "I would wish to indicate the determining relationship between architectonic reality and physical well-being. I hope that we may implicitly instruct the reader in the comprehensive impact of every where of any place. This requires development of an idea or theory of place in terms of human being, of space designed as the volumetric expression of successful existence between earth and sky, of space cherishing as it amplifies the experience of being alive, and the capability of endless beginnings, and the entrusted liberty of motion, of particular space connected to multiple spatialities, a particular space that is open, receptive, and communicant, yet sheltering particular life." So this is what I wrote kind of in response to that. I said, we don't think that the layout of a house or a street can determine our capacity for being. Living as we do on top of one another with no room to stretch our legs or for our children to play, and being so isolated, not knowing our next door neighbors, not knowing whom we can depend on in an emergency is a political question. But design, as I'm thinking about it, is more than just an architectural component. It's more than just the arrangement of physical objects in order to make something. Design is also the speech that we use to build and give meaning to the world around us. And June Jordan knew this. If you changed how people conceived of living, you could also change their understanding of themselves and their relations with others, breaking the inertia of this unlivable life. The way we talk about this life and living, the language we use, builds a kind of structure that turns the horizon, that point where potentiality meets the substance of our reality, into a mirage. When we say housing for all and the government responds with the homeless are being temporarily housed in hostels to avoid the spread of the virus, they're building a linguistic structure that defines the realm of the possible, and that implicitly tells us to want less, to expect that total reconfiguration is out of the question. Like a poorly designed building, linguistic structures affect how we think, how we breathe, and how we move and how we act. That mold sticks to our skin. This one, in particular, is the preservation of a system of organization that places capital before all else. It ties our hands and feet together. But if we follow Jordan, everywhere and every place has a comprehensive impact. And so everything we do and say that brings place and space into existence, that defines its contours, that explicitly makes clear who can and cannot enter, also has an impact. And so to get free, we have to redesign linguistic structures before they morph into linguistic loops, or in the meantime, at least get comfortable with repetition. So I was kind of thinking about this as a way to contextualize my game. So my game would be called This Is Not a Disaster Game, and it's more of a thought experiment, I think, than an actual game. But I was thinking about it as a kind of navigable multiplayer simulation where the aim is to make the Earth habitable using every resource but money. And by habitable, I think I mean in the way that June Jordan imagined space as a volumetric expression between earth and sky, as space as a kind of holder of hopes and dreams. So the aim is to reach this state where people can live free. And this is a kind of open-ended aim, and that's important to me. I was thinking about this question, the question of freedom is never done, it's never decided. And so this game is one that keeps going and going. And so the players have to decide their priorities. What does freedom mean to them? They might, for example, first decide that they want to seize and kind of repurpose property. I think often when we think about money and the flow of capital, it is kind of at the center of our lives. And I'm interested in a game where the aim is not accumulation of land or property or resource, but the question of identifying resources that are already around us, that we already kind of live amongst, and parceling them out. So a game that encourages us to use relational skills in order to navigate the world, to imagine that we can make money inconsequential. So, for example, the first aim in this game might be to secure housing for everyone in a specific local area. And so the players would have to think, would have to come up with a way to do that isn't just, using money to buy flats and housing everyone. They might seek to find, empty housing and squat. That means that in terms of their skill set, they need people who are willing to risk imprisonment or know kind of squatting law and rights. They need people who can do teach-ins, people who can do political education. So the players would have to decide how they will acquire these skills and how they'll bargain for them as well, because they can't use money. And so they'll interact with a range of obstacles along the way. So those threats could be state violence, the police, NGOs who might try and co-opt those movements. Also kind of parliamentary politics, media misconstruction, misconstruction of the kind of work that they're doing, other people, the right wing. There are loads of things that might stop them from being able to kind of reach the goal that they set in terms of what freedom is. So then more of the questions that they might think about if their aim, in this imagined scenario was to secure housing, what strategy will they use to take over the land? How will they organize the space once they have it? How do you feed people without money? So the only kind of rule that I thought, I wanted to keep it kind of open-ended, but the only rule that I thought was that you can't use money, but everything else is at your disposal. And I think I wanted to take that approach to really hammer home that we have enough resources around us really to adequately address all of these problems, climate crisis, capitalist crisis, all of these overlapping crises that plague us, really. So that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of my game. I hope I explained that well.
Amazing.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that you have seized property as one of the aims.
That's the first. Well,
That's pretty cool. Did you imagine this as a board game or as a video game?
That's a good question. I think I first imagined it kind of like The Sims, so not as a board game at all, actually. But I think it is the kind of game, it has a similar kind of structure to Class Struggle, so it could be flattened. And I also think it could be simplified. In line with your kind of game, you could really simplify what you're asking people to imagine freedom looks like, because that does look different for everybody. So not as a board game initially.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Electronic.
Yeah.
Nice. Sweet. All right. Micah?
Shall I kick off? Well, this talk is going to be on a very different register, people.
Lower the tone, it's fine.
Sorry, my voice is also a bit harsh, a bit cold. So, I don't play that many games as such as a philosopher. I think we do language games. So in the end, we're going to come to language games. But the last time I saw a game played, I was on a trip from Arbroath to London. And I was traveling with an incredibly good filmmaker from East London, now living in East London, Rihanna Zaman. And Rihanna was playing with Camille, and they were playing a game, and I don't know, it might have been called Snap, I don't know. And you put cards down, and once you see two the same cards, you have to go snap. And then you get to have all the cards. Sometimes you have to make sure that the other person gets all the cards. Sometimes you have to make sure yourself gets all the cards. The game has many different variations. And so they were playing, and maybe at this point it helps to know that Camille is 3 years old. So at some point, Rihanna said snap, took the cards, and Camille just threw the cards on the floor of the train, had to cry, had to be cuddled. And I was with Camille. I could totally feel him, you know. I was like, yeah, man, this is how I would react too. And I react like that because I was mostly raised by my slightly older brother who was very affirmative. So he never taught me to lose games. I just didn't receive the training, stupidly enough. And I remember one summer, we just moved to a new place. It was a tiny village. We had just gotten this farm. And we would be farming from then on. Sounds dramatic. And we knew no one. So my brother and me started to play Monopoly. This was, of course, no success. That was very clear to both of us because I couldn't stand losing. And my brother would always win because he was older, right? So what we did, because we were raised by kind of a socialist mom, we seized the means of production. So we immediately got all the streets, all the houses, all the hotels, and then we started to play against the bank. This was a major success because the bank kept running over our street and they were losing money and we had to lend them money. And we were like on the same team, like winning from the bank. We didn't realize at that age that we had become the bankers. I think that was a step too difficult. You know, I was 7, give me a break. But what I did learn at that moment, apart from seizing the means of production, was also like, hey, if the situation doesn't work out and you're pitted against each other while you want to be friends, by having imposed competition on you, better change the situation, right? And work together. But sometimes that means you have to look at the situation afresh. And I learned this again later, after the summer of super best friends with my brother, when I started to study theater. And then Keith Johnstone, a theater improvisation person, wrote a book called Impro. You can find the game back in this book, right? Give my sources away. And the game is sometimes like, you know, you go through it every day and wow, the space you're in, obviously not in this pavilion because it's new and it's shiny, it's beautiful, it really catches your eye. But you know, in the everyday, sometimes you don't see your area anymore. So what you can do, and I'm going to try to play it, I haven't not played it in a long time, but so you point at something, and it needs to go obviously very fast, because otherwise it doesn't work. So you point to something and give it a name that it doesn't yet have. So it's going to be sheep, cow, train, ship, crate, wardrobe, noose, moose, yeah, snake. So, and everything becomes new again. It's really worth doing it. And at some point, if you play it long enough and go a bit faster than I'm now, then you see that the fork just lifts. And at some point, you only have to think about this game, and the fork lifts, right? So now, back to money. You can try it out if you want. I can give you a moment. Just do it.
Oh, I just called it a ceiling.
The artist.
I lost. I lost the game.
Now, And then I thought, because I thought we were particularly going to speak about the redistribution of money in art in this moment, which is my mistake. I don't know why, maybe because it was an art gallery. And I thought, wow, we can actually use this same game, like we point to an artist, and we give them a name of a very famous artist, Marina Abramovic. And we pay Jay what Marina Abramovic would have been paid. I think it's an amazing game.
This is a great game.
Right? And then at the same time, we point to Marina Abramovic, and we give her a name and go Meike van der Drift. And then we pay Marina Abramovic the money Meike van der Drift would have been paid. And of course, we have to find a catch to get Marina Abramovic involved. And, and this is the point where, like Jay, I know Jay, first and foremost, I guess, as a poet. And what is that language game of poetry is to bring meaning and language as close as possible together so that there's more potentiality going. And for Marina Abramovic, we can use marketing, because marketing takes meaning and language as far away possible from each other so that there's as little meaning as possible in that moment, right? So what we offer Marina Abramovic to take part in this game is to be rediscovered by the audiences she knows so well. You cannot refuse that, right? So that is my art game. Radical redistribution.
I do think we should all take a moment to play this game, though. I know I just failed horribly, but I am the sacrificial lamb in this situation. I think it'd be quite cool. So, someone famous, right?
I know. I have to look at my phone.
Britney Spears, right?
Britney
Got the
Spears.
mics.
I got the Britney Spears.
But do you want to be Britney Spears right
No,
now?
no, I mean, you have a curator.
Yeah, because you'd be owned by your father.
Oh, no.
That
No. That's no.
That goes down a dark path. I can't think of a single artist.
People have that often
one
when they
artist
point
has
at
come-
me.
Do they have to be living? No.
No,
Living or dead? Okay.
no, I don't mind.
Oh, we're waiting for me to.
Yeah.
Oh my god, the pressure. An artist.
I know, suddenly there are none, right?
Your brain is
Imagine
empty.
a world without
Audience suggestions? Damien Hirst.
Damien
I
Hirst.
love that. That would be well paid.
Yeah,
Oh.
it would.
It's interesting that that's the principal thing we're thinking about. We're being like, oh, wealthy artists,
Yeah.
as opposed to their talent or like practice or
Or
anything
like
like
Ai Weiwei.
Oh yeah, Ai Weiwei. Yeah. that'd be cool.
Wealthy artist.
Yeah.
Jeff Koons, wealthy
Jeff Koons.
artist.
Yeah. Nice. All right.
Yeah, I'll talk of some artists as well, so I'll flex my muscle there.
Go for it.
Okay, dogs, I believe there might be some slides if it's all cool. I guess I'll lean on them a bit. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is such a privilege, and also what a distinguished panel, and also just really incredible to have conversations about material conditions at the Serpentine Gallery. That doesn't happen often. If anything, of course, money runs through the arteries of the space, and yet now it's now a bit put on the table, and there's a discourse around, and that's very, very fascinating. So please, the next one, because this is, I guess, just a little intro one. So definitely a bit of dread entered me when I started thinking again also about the brief. Sounds easy: money, young people, play, and at all times I found myself at a dead end of sadness and grief, because perhaps because I'm myself informed by the personal experiences of also 8 years of squatting in London, and just also thinking about the plight of a working class person in the city. Well, exactly, unless you are privileged enough to come from a middle class background or have property here, if you're a young person in London, essentially your existence is that of distance to real estate and to property. And when I think of money, I mean, money is nice to spend on your little, maybe, your night out, or clothes, or food for that night, but eventually the dread of material security will come in, and that is all to do with let's be honest, again, property, and London is a space that is so full of speculating when it comes to that, right? So we're all yeah. And then so really, I think this talk will be quite informed by precisely that, my own personal insecurity when it comes to any attempt of grasping that material security, and one that I mean, if you're a working class kid in London without security, that's what you're gonna have to deal with. And so I come from video games industry background, so I guess I thought of those a little bit more. And I slightly cheated, I suppose. I thought of like a couple of ideas, but they're super, super basic. And then I kind of also thought at the end that perhaps that we shouldn't be reinventing the bicycle, and then some of the most important playful tools are kind of perhaps already with us. So few ideas that I had was I thought my game needs to be investigative, it needs to be exploratory, it needs to be playful, all the buzzwords. And I guess but then there are a couple of games. So anyways, we'll go for the first one. Now, please, next slide. And it's really nice also to be in an artistic institution, and the fact that I can then flex my artistic muscles. I did do that, a BA at St. Martin's in fine arts and the rest, so I do know some artists, and 𝘀𝗁cie𝗂𝘁 is actually one of the few political artists that I really admire, because he didn't just make political art, he made tools out of his political art. So, so this is the piece by him in 1971. He invited a bunch of his celeb friends, artist friends, in a space in New York City, to have an exhibition opening, a party. And upon arrival to the exhibition, to the opening of the exhibition, the viewers were met with 142 investigative pieces of corruption and horrible, just abuse of power by the biggest, so-called slum landlord, essentially, just of very, very poor areas of New York City at the time. And the piece was meant to be then shown at Guggenheim, but Guggenheim saw it and actually canceled the exhibition, and is to this day seen as one of the biggest kind of institutional critique pieces. And what he did is that he didn't necessarily just create a political art piece, he actually made a weapon out of his art. He made it a tool out of his art. And this is my worry sometimes with political art, is that it creates these symbols that essentially maybe preach to the converted. Let's be honest, they meet the audiences that probably already have politics that people share. And so I'm thinking, would it be possible now with the new introduction of inventive ways of presenting data and news, that a game today in 2021 that perhaps would do this type of investigative work could be released via a video game, and maybe not necessarily released, let's say, via The Guardian or the Steam, where we just end up in an echo chamber, but maybe via the Financial Times. Actually, there is precedent to that. A game called Uber Game, an Uber game, was released via the Financial Times, and that really showed the terrible plight that the Uber drivers go through. So I'm just thinking, how could a game be a tool? So that was one idea, that we produce and we create data. We present data in a game-like reaction, and then it can actually be used for then, whether that's policy change or whatnot. Okay, next slide, please. And then this is another introduction of one of my favorite artists, I suppose. Again, utilizing real-life aspect of politics in his work, and going back to your idea, Lola, of Sims as well, because that is a massively political game. It's so funny how people just sort of see it as I don't know, just some interior design game, but actually incredible social dynamics, and actually lack of creativity and/or diversity, of course, in the game happens. And yeah, also, let's be honest, it's a bit of a I guess a sandbox to imagine your capitalist ideas. One of the jokes was like, wait, how does it go? But yeah, the Sims is essentially where you realize your biggest dreams, i.e., having a house and having friends. Yes. So, anyways, but going back to this, probably my favorite political artist is Santiago Sierra, who Yeah, he works with real, yeah, he very much works with real people and actually gets a lot of flack over it. So he will pay a day's wage to migrants, for instance, and we'll just have them do manual labor in a gallery or so, or just stand in the gallery. Or one of his more controversial pieces, of course, also was that in the Venice Biennale in 2004, no one was allowed to, only Spanish citizens were allowed to go inside the pavilion. So he really just kind of flips that liberal idea of being very, very comfortable upon seeing a political piece and actually makes somebody really, really uncomfortable. And so it also kind of references me a little bit to, of course, David Graeber's idea of bullshit jobs and again, if you're a young working class person in London, you probably will do, well, interesting, bullshit jobs will not be your first job because those are usually actually important jobs as retail and or, some, service industry jobs, but it's that lower managerial class that really then becomes the bullshit job. That this is late David Graeber's idea of that is a theory that postulates the existence of meaningless jobs and analyzes their societal harm. So I thought that in this, it would be interesting to create a game where perhaps it's a bit of a simulator, because I think most of us, maybe working class a lot in London, definitely felt that existence of. Okay, I'm now let's describe the game. So at the bottom you see the Sims there, and I'm thinking, what if you are, a person in a room, well, let's say it's like a studio flat, or maybe even one-bedroom flats, and you have to do a few things, so you get up, you have a shower, you make your meal, and then, I don't know, you pet your pet, and then you go to work. But every day, as the days go by, your flat and your place gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and it becomes more and more difficult to make do, essentially. And again, I was telling you today before the talk as well, I think how my experience is fully, I lived in zone 1, and then I lived in zone 2, and then in 3 and 4 and 5, and I'm in zone 6, and actually this year I'm leaving London, because that's just, I've been priced out. It is what it is, and it just seems, and again, this is one of those probably preaching to converted ideas, but it's exploratory because it really places you, I suppose, in very, very much understanding the conditions that so many young people find themselves in. Yeah, if they don't stay with their parents, they will probably, and again, maybe 15 years ago it was possible to pay £600 for like a one-bedroom flat in zone 1. Now that will buy you a small room in like zone 6 with 12 other people, and that's just the reality of the city. And yeah, it's very complicated to even have that conversation about money, I suppose, when this is just so much of our everyday. Anyways, next slide, thank you. And this is, I suppose, the final one where I was just thinking that, the idea of play was, especially in the space of fine art, was beautifully, I suppose, popularized by the Situationist movement of the 1960s. Reminded me a lot, again, about what you were saying, Lola, about really just reimagining what a city or a space can be, because that's what the real idea was very much what the Situationists were doing. And this is what I'm saying, why necessarily reinvent the bike? There are some incredible games already that do reimagine what the city could be, and the best of them challenge it and maybe even create these discursive and challenging, I don't know, situations in the city that really make us not see a city as what it became. So I guess fairly recently is that it is just a vehicle for transporting of goods and labor. That's all the city is. It's not for people to live in. And it would be great to maybe rethink that. And playing something as silly as capture the flag can be a subversive tool if done in the right location. For instance, gentrified areas, etc. Local businesses all of the time don't necessarily like that. But then I was saying that, and it's just, well, but also some communities are way more criminalized than others. It's very easy for a bunch of like middle-class white folk to perhaps capture the flag. Most definitely not as easy for criminalized communities most of the time. People of color in London who would not get away with doing stuff like this. So I'm thinking maybe not necessarily does it have to be running around or something. You can also, the destruction of arcades, for instance, is something that's really upsetting. It was one place where working class kids were able to hang out and play, and we just don't have those spaces anymore in London. So maybe we can maybe play even Pokemon Go in one space, or bring our Nintendo Switches or whatever. Again, it's reclaiming those spaces and thinking of their power, thinking of what demands can we set out for that space, and and just, I guess, having fun with it. Because, next slide, be realistic, demand the impossible. That is the beautiful situationist quote that I try and live my life by. And yeah, let's try and do that, because otherwise it is all really depressing and sad. But we can't tell that to the kids. They have to be hopeful and actually, hopefully, bring that better tomorrow that we can all hope for. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. That's an awesome game, and one that I really resonates. At one point, I lived in a shoebox in Brixton. I was paying £700 a month. Like, I had a bed, and my kitchen was like where you are, and that was kind of it. Really, it was depressing.
Hella depressing.
That's super awesome. All right, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I think if anyone had any. Otherwise, I can just kind of dive in. No?
Shut everyone up.
Okay, no one's jumping in. That's totally fine. I mean, I guess I had one question, which was... Oh, is there a question?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, go for it. Cool.
Oh, sorry, okay. So basically, my question is related more or less to kind of each topic, and obviously the kind of introduction of the idea of the game that in a way kind of allowed the discourse about who is dictating the rules and which are the rules in the games. Every game, in a way, I would say, has some rules, and the people, in a way, that play the game have to, in a way, collaborate in itself. As you said, there is a conflict between them. But the important thing is that there is actually something that governs, right, the sort of relationship between the people that play the game. And at the same time, this is related to architecture, because at the same, there's a person that in a way create or design the space to a group of people, but then who is the person that actually decide how the people move or interact within the space? So my, in a way, question was related to, in general, or your topics, and what is the rule in your game? Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, actually, because I think you touched on something that, definitely I noticed when I was developing mine, and also when I was doing the sound piece, which is that you kind of want to approach these things with a certain level of openness, but I think you have to be realistic and face the rules as well, right? And face the limitations that make it a boundaried thing that can be recognizable as a game. And when I was even doing the sound piece, I was like, oh wow, you're kind of a dictatorial artist here. You are actually determining how all of this works, and how otherwise what is it? So yeah, that's really, so I think it's quite an interesting question. I don't know what everyone else.
I think the Keith Johnstone game, the theater improvisation, which is based on games, they're very non-competitive, and usually there's just, in theater impro, there's just one rule. And that is affirm what somebody else approaches you with. So if you get tea with a slightly thing, you know it's going to be poison. So you have to die on that moment, right? Drinking the poison tea, or whatever it is. So it is always saying yes to whatever happens, right? And this is why theater impro is quite unhelpful to stage political protest with. But it's very, very good to get rid of some of the stress for why you need political protest, right? And this is, I think, why I brought the Keith Johnstone game in, because it's a game that doesn't make you win or lose. It's just a game to refresh the conditions under which you live, to then see what can come next. Yeah.
I think with my game, I guess when you're trying to provide an invitation to other people to imagine, you don't actually want to give them that many rules. So I thought of my kind of one rule of not being able to use money more as a kind of governing structure that in a way mimics, how we live. We live in a very rule-bound, boundaried society, our relations are boundaried by all of these kind of structures of power and structures of violence. And to me, I wanted to leave the possibility for the players to bring in elements of the fantastical as well, right? Like, so maybe when I was describing the game, people thought very practically about how do you get money when you don't have food? You steal it, or you share it, etc. But I wanted there also to be space to be like, I don't know, you're magic, you're a wizard, and you magic the food, and everybody is, you know, everybody is saved and everybody is fed, but in ways that undermines the kind of purpose of the game or the teaching element of the game, right? But yeah, I think that's what play is about. It's about like expanding and contracting those boundaries, and giving people the space to figure out actually what it is, how they will conceive of the governing structure that you've given them, and what boundaries they'll set for themselves, because that's really interesting. Someone might be like, okay, yeah, magic is involved and I've solved every problem, and another person might take a really kind of strategic and tactical approach, and that tells us something differently about how people are situating themselves in relation to others and situating themselves in relation to these structures of violence.
Yeah, well, I guess first reaction when I hear about trying to describe too much of the games is that, again, coming from games industries, like game designers, a whole profession by themselves, and they spend hours and hours and, you know, have full salaries trying to understand those intricacies exactly of manipulating this bit or that and getting some sort of reaction out of this. So this is not even an answer that any of us can even have in a very, I guess, profound way, because there's a whole science behind it, and the best, I guess, game designers do find ways to make you think as eventually what they want you to think with different mechanics and or ways or rewards or different ways of structuring the game. So. But again, I know about the themes that we're even talking of today. It's just the game is rigged, you know. It already is, and I already know who's the winner there and who's the loser. And although there's so much beauty and kind of naivete and some kind history of the idea of play, again, seeing today, I mean, just constantly the negative effects and manipulation. I mean, Jesus Christ, how much. Just radicalization of the far right happens in the video games industry as well, all maybe somehow disguised under this, you know, just a playful space, and parents allow games to, you know, kids to just perhaps just play safely, but actually all end up going very, very, very bad towards a very bad direction very quickly. So yeah, but I think you're correct in saying that the person that creates the game can already say that they are in a hierarchical, you know, relationship here with the player. That there's, you know, this, even as an anarchist, I can say that's a reasonable understanding of those relationships, I suppose.
You said something that made me question the terminology that we're using. You talked about play and then you talked about games. Now, I don't think those two things are the same thing. Actually, now that I think about it, because to play, there's a kind of infinite openness, and a game implies a certain closedness, actually.
It depends as well. Like, you know, but for instance, I think of massive multiplayer games, right? They only give you a certain outline, but then it's the relationships that you build inside, or perhaps the communities that you build, and things that allow something to blossom. So, but yeah, I understand. I agree that these are terms that should be defined somehow a bit more.
I think also within the game there is the possibility of a kind of infinite playfulness, or in the relations that you have inside the game. I think whenever I think of playing a game when I was younger, it's not necessarily the game itself, it's the fact that I played with other people. And that's what I remember. And I think that's where the potential lies, more than just like the concept of play or the concept of the game. Which I think all of our kind of games had in common in a way. It's like relation, whether you're like trapped inside a building that's becoming smaller and smaller, or whether you're concerned about like how the like money that people will get. Yeah, that it all comes back to like, you know, our ability to be with one another and to know each other in meaningful ways.
But I think also with play, what you see is also with animals like calves, they angle their tail and they make a ba 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 sound, sort of, not with this voice obviously. And then the rest of the cow herd knows, oh, the little calf is playing, it's not actually in panic, you know. And I think with a game, the rules mark that safe space, that something can happen what you cannot do in the everyday life. And the same is with playing. If I go now kind of playing, I don't know, it would just be quite out of place, sometimes unfortunately. You know, so play often requires at least a wink or something, like, you know, like, hey, this is going to be make-believe.
I suppose I agree with that when it comes to like actual games, but I also think about like the gamification of life and how like you can be playful in all of our, obviously we're all playful in all of our relations, but in everyday life there are these like kind of hard and fast rules versus I think childhood when you're kind of not bound by those. And that was something that I was thinking about with like developing Dosh. It was like kids, they have a inkling of the real world and they are in many ways bound by it. But there's also like in actual play, like when you watch them, there's a kind of like, it's so open-ended and it kind of goes and it turns into something else. First of all, it's the floor is lava, then it becomes then it becomes like, we're gonna do cooking today, you know what I mean? Like, whereas I feel like games themselves, and when I think about like kind of like the lives that we all live, we're all playing this game, right? Like we're all kind of like sussing out and we all kind of know the rules, and the rules are quite intense and very, very clear, and they will like slap you down.
And narrow, very narrow
And
as well.
exactly.
But doesn't it also then hit the point exactly that when does that self-awareness comes in is when you start getting anxiety about how you're going to be perceived in the world in order for you to then, you know, somehow meet your material needs. So always feels, well, I mean, obviously, well, what excuse rich people have? I'm not sure, but yeah, it's but again, you know, thinking like big sports, like the big sports events as well, that there's just the idea of the game, then we just enjoy ourselves, and there's a community behind it now, you know, and it's just a game, but really there's so much politics in it all as well.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting when you said that The Sims is super political, right?
But even football now, I guess, or the Olympics, right?
I mean, if football isn't political, I don't know what is, right? Yeah.
I think also what you were saying about children made me think about how we call that innocence, right, in children. But actually, I think to take children seriously as our, you know, co-collaborators in the world that we're seeking to build, I think it's to understand that it's not just innocence, it's like a way of knowing, right? Like children have this wonder because they haven't been beaten down by the rules, or they don't know the rules in loads of different ways. And I think part of the project of the imagination is refinding that wonder for our political projects, because often what makes those projects seem kind of cyclical and dull and never ending is that they're repetitive, or there isn't that sense of childlike wonder. We're not able to look at something that we know to be a table and call it a cow or a sheep or a whatever. And the fact that kids can do that, I think, is a skill that we have to learn from them, definitely.
It's nice because Maria Lugones actually writes about this, of course, clearly, where there's a certain sense of play, what she calls, that's very competitive and it's dealt with winning. And she says, that's not the play that I want to recognize, right? The play that I want to recognize is where I can lose my reason, so I can find new worlds around me.
Exactly.
And I think there is a major difference.
I think we have time for one very last question or comment, if someone has one. I think there's one just here.
Oh, cool. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the thoughtful and generative conversations. I have two questions that I think are related, but I'm not sure. And I suppose the first one is a comment around the articulation of language and thinking through the ways in which language allows different systems to take shape. And I suppose it made me think on a kind of serious note around the ways in which, like the history of money, and those ways in which, for example, the banknote came to be, and the ways in which, like, the promise and the kind of like I owe you, right? And the promise and the debt that comes with that promise, which is a linguistic, you know, performative action that occurs. And I wonder, in the poetics that was described in the meanings, if the game is just a trap, actually, and is actually something that makes or gives importance to money in a way that seems like this conversation is trying to subvert and push against. So I was just like, that's a comment. I think it's related to the 𝘀cie𝘂𝘁 example, but I kind of don't get that example as a game. So I wonder, I'm just like kind of curious around that. And then a quick side note, I didn't catch the designer for the 𝘀cie𝘂𝘂𝘁 game. I don't know if you mentioned, but yeah, those are things.
I'm the designer, along with the team at the Serpentine as well. They really put a lot into it, but the idea is that it accompanies the sound piece. But do we want to do because I think that's a super interesting question, and obviously it comes at the very, very end. But does everyone want to do a quick like response to that, and then we can and then we can kind of like wrap up. So who wants to go first?
Well, I guess I'll give a little what's the word, clarification on the 𝘀cie𝘂𝘂𝘁 piece. The way that the information was presented there in that gallery was very straightforward. It's pieces of paper on the wall, go ahead and read it, I suppose, right? And the precedent that I was thinking about that perhaps I didn't explain very well, recently there was a collaboration between a video games company and the Financial Times, where they created the Uber game, where essentially you find out, you know, you play as an Uber driver and you perhaps drive people for about 5 days, and then when you feel like actually you're earning quite a lot and it's all good, and then at the end of the game all of your expenses come out and you find out that you've been earning $2 an hour or something like that. So I guess that's the big spoiler. But the beauty of it, of course, was that it was released via center-right newspaper. But anyways, a certain experience and information was presented just in a very, fairly simplistic way via a game. And knowing that now at this point, I suppose games are bigger than video, than music and film industries combined, so many young people actually take in so much information via that medium, and it is possible to utilize it for presentation of information in a much more creative way. People hardly now go to a piece of paper and just read it all in full. Maybe it is possible to just utilize that medium for a very quick exploration of whether that's corruption and or any kind of news that should be known about way in a much more depth by much larger populations that would perhaps be picking up something that is written in a very, very basic form. So that was it. But I really want to agree with your provocation in the sense of that. It sounded almost Adornian, you know. I'm not a scholar in any shape or form of his thought, but he sees so much of culture as a trap, right? In a sense that it's like the one space where kids get to play politics, whereas actually, you know, the adults are essentially playing their material games, and you know what. So much of what we do culturally, whether that's, you know, sport or circus, or of course he talks so much about film as well, is just spaces where people that are essentially losing and will lose out on all the material, on any access to material wealth, are just kind of pretending to each other that they have any power, whereas really it's all taken away from them. And it does feel sometimes so often in all culture there is reproduced with that, but also squeezes out that enjoyment of any play or game, knowing that everything is so rigged against you anyways.
All right, yeah, do you want to?
I might be misunderstanding the question, the kind of provocation, but I guess for me, I think it kind of depends on the game, right? Like I do understand this idea of, I think gamification is a trap, right? Like the way that we're taught to think about the very serious aspects of how we live and the disastrous ways in which we're forced to live through games, like, right? So we can only think of the plight of Uber drivers if we you know, be an Uber driver for 3 days on the computer, which is like dystopian and incredibly terrible when you think about labor practices and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, so I think that kind of gamification definitely is a trap in a way, and limits possibilities, limits our ability to really become conscious of the dire material situation that we're in. But I also think there are spaces in which games might be able to open up and unlock and absolutely do the opposite of that. But it depends on, I think, the environment in which that game is conducted, what the rules are, how people relate to one another, where is the game set? You know, is it hierarchical? Is it not hierarchical? There are so many conditions, I think, that don't maybe make me think about that provocation in lots of different ways, I guess. But yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it.
Cool. And Micah, do you want to have the last word on this?
So if I think about language and the game, and if they're entangled, if I understand your provocation correctly, like in the case with me and my brother, with Monopoly, it was quite easy because we had an idea of what the rules should be, and by subverting the rules, we could reorder the conditions, right? And with some language games, like the language game of the social language game of money, it's very easy to drop the language game, but then the people that have power don't drop the language game. And then suddenly we're just back at the material conditions, right? Because the space between them is actually quite close, rather than far away, right? So even if we narrate things differently, and we do that all the time, and it's called political consciousness raising, right? That is what you were talking about in your description of the game. This is what you are doing with your game, and it's actually your artists are also constantly doing that. It's consciousness raising. We do not need to accept the conditions as they are in the way that they are talked about. And then we're back to what you said as a child about your poor self. I wish somebody had a conversation with me that I was not responsible for these conditions, right? And that is, I think, the answer that Jay already gave in the beginning, and I think that answers your question, if I understand it right.
Thank you all for coming and joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you all for listening and for participating as well. So we're gonna basically all go to the bar after this for 5 minutes. And then the sound piece itself, which is the kind of instigation for all of this, will be played. It's 45 minutes, and it's kind of designed specifically for this space. We spent a lot of time making things come out of speakers and all of that kind of stuff, so it's super cool. And you can just bring a drink, rock up, sit wherever you like, walk around the space, and just kind of enjoy it. Thank you all so much for coming, and good night.